Hello, Metal Militia! It's your local femboy raccoon Slayer here. Today, I'm gonna talk about a super underground and obscure band that you posers have never heard of, and definitely haven't heard on the radio. I'm talking about Metallica. I was being sarcastic if you couldn't tell. Metallica aren't just a heavy metal band, they are a household name, and in the eyes of some, a brand. Even if you somehow never heard their music, you know the name Metallica. They are so big, they even appeared in Fortnite recently, so I doubt even most normies are unaware of their music by now. In fact, if you are a tried and true metal fan like I am, there's a chance that Metallica was one of your first exposures to metal. Whether or not you want to admit that fact, it's the truth. We all have to start somewhere, and there's no shame in that. I know I sure as hell loved Metallica back in the late 2000s, since I had an iPod Shuffle with some Metallica songs on it. Yeah, that poor man's iPod without a screen, and you didn't even know which song was gonna play next. That's what I had. But anyways, I primarily had the 80s and 90s stuff on my iPod. You know, stuff such as Master of Puppets and the Black Album. And I, as an elementary school kid who was still afraid of harsh vocals, absolutely loved Metallica and consider them to be my favorite band. I thought Unalive Them All, yeah, I'm saying that so YouTube doesn't nuke me, was the heaviest and most brutal album I had ever heard. Metallica are the purest definition of what I would like to call a basic bitch metal band, which also applies to stuff such as System of a Down, Disturbed, and maybe Linkin Park's early material if you count that as metal. That's to say that, whatever the quality of the music, some elitist in his mom's basement will hate the band simply because of the popularity and easy to get into nature of the music. It's unfortunate, but some metalheads feel the need to convince themselves that they are superior for being into exclusively extreme metal, when in reality that's simply a musical preference. But where was I? Oh yeah, Metallica. Today I thought I would cover 2 albums in the Metallica discography. Why 2? Because this is basically a double album that was split between 2 releases, and it shows given the naming. But also because it's another black sheep era of a popular band that divides fan opinion, something I love to cover nowadays. I'm talking about Load and Reload. These 2 albums from the mid-90s were an even further departure from that even seen on the Black Album, where the band almost entirely abandoned thrash metal for a more blues rock and alternative-inspired hard rock album. Despite still being a chart-topping blockbuster hit, many metalheads felt betrayed by this era of the band, seeing it as a complete sellout to the alternative crowd, and even coined the name Alternica as an insult for this era of the band. To add insult to injury, Metallica changed their logo, cut their hair, started wearing guyliner, and even took photos of each other making out. More like gay-Talica, am I right? In all seriousness though, how does having short hair even affect the music? Also, guyliner effing rules. I even wear it myself. I mean, this certainly isn't as flamboyant as hair bands or, you know, me. I'm gonna take a listen to this album with fresh ears, since it's been a few years since I went out of my way to listen to Metallica, and I'm interested to see whether or not these albums are a putrid sellout or a misunderstood gem in the discography. Load starts off with Ain't My Bitch. Ooh, we got ourselves a swearing a Metallica song title. How bad butt is that? This is a strong start to the album, with a fairly speedy tempo and a bluesy solo. Though this may have given fans the false impression that Load and Reload were going to simply be a bluesy version of the Black Album. That's followed by the even bluesier 2x4. This one even has a swing vibe to it. A good song, but it's clear this album is shifting further away from the Black Album with each song, and some people thought that the Black Album was a sellout. The House That Jack Built is even slower with some grunge vibes to it. But if you think that's out of left field, wait until you hear Until It Sleeps. This straight up borders on alternative radio rock. I wouldn't be surprised if many metalheads gave up on this album after hearing this track. There's definitely an undercurrent of grunge and alternative on this album, mixed in with the blues metal tracks. The biggest example actually would probably be King of the Day, which straight up features a happy sounding major key at points. And Mama Said is a full-blown country ballad. More like cunt-Talica, am I right? This album gets experimental at times, which is something that divides opinion. Some say that it ruined Metallica, and is nothing but sellout garbage, and that they should just stick to thrash. but others love the diversity of the album. It's got metal, classic rock, blues, country, and alternative all mixed in a blender. And the bluesier tracks give off a nice rural or western vibe that are perfect for driving through the countryside too. You know what this album and Reload kinda remind me of? It reminds me of Judas Priest's Point of Entry and Turbo. The first was an album that played around with a more commercial AOR sound, and Turbo, which featured a straight-up glam metal sound. Both of these albums, despite their faults, are decent at what they set out to do. And the Load and Reload duology, I think, is pretty good for a bluesy hard rock album, and I applaud the band for experimenting with their sound. Sure, at times it does sell out towards the alternative sound, which metalheads hated at the time, but overall, Load is pretty solid for what it's attempting to do. Now we have to see if Reload is of the same quality. Well, let's just say it goes from 0 to 60 in just a few seconds, opening up with the iconic track Fuel. This song is a masterpiece, a banger so good even people who absolutely detest Load and Reload love it. It's just the perfect song for racing, with that speed metal sound that honestly gives me a Motorhead kind of vibe. Hell, the only thing keeping this song from getting a perfect 10 is that it wasn't recorded by Motorhead. Imagine how badass that would sound. This sadly gives way to the way less cool The Memory Remains. It's an alright song, very bluesy, although I'm not the biggest fan of the sections with Marianne Faithfull. Devil's Dance is also good in my book, albeit not a highlight. Sounds like something off of the Black Album. But what really stands out is a sequel to The Unforgiven. A very interesting thing to do, and like many unnecessary sequels, it's a step down from the original. It just sounds like the original Unforgiven, just with more country and blues inspirations. Metallica would actually go on to record The Unforgiven 3 on, I think, Death Magnetic, if I'm not mistaken. I love the arrogance of Better Than You and the slow ballad Low Man's Lyric, but otherwise, I feel like this album is just a step down from Load. And the more unremarkable parts sound like table scraps from that album. I feel like if Metallica had just combined the best of Load and Reload into one album, this would have been received a bit better and held in higher regard. Unfortunately, I found myself disinterested while listening to this sequel album. It starts off with one of Metallica's best songs, but much of it isn't remarkable outside of a few tracks. I feel like this experiment had outstayed its welcome by this point, and like I said, a condensed Load and Reload hybrid album would have been much better. This is not a bad album, but it's got too much filler for my liking. So there it is, the Load and Reload cycle. Not as bad as some people say, but it definitely devolves into above mediocre by the second half of Reload. These albums have their fans and detractors, and while I'd say I'm a bit more positive on them, they do have their faults and there's a noticeable quality bias towards Load. I mean, the name Reload just gives it away. More Load, but not of the same quality, even if it starts off with one of Metallica's best songs. But to say that these are bad, even at its worst, would be lying in my eyes. Sure, there's some stuff, particularly on Reload, that's middle-of-the-road background noise, but is it bad as, well, let's just say what they had in store for the early 2000s? No. And I definitely give props to the band for experimenting with new things. The 90s saw tons of experimentation in metal for better and for worse, but Load, I think, experimented with blues rock and grunge in a tasteful way. Reload was simply that experiment outstaying its welcome. I mean, these albums are nowhere near as bad as, let's say, those Glam Goes Grunge albums from the same time. I really need to make a video on that. I can see why some people love these albums, and honestly, the next time I go to the record store and see them, I'll pick them up and add them to my collection. There is some good stuff on here that some Metallica fans haven't even heard because they write the album off based off of popular opinion and haven't even listened to much of it, if at all, which is a very close-minded thing some people really need to stop doing. So, if you've never heard these albums, I'd say give them a shot, although I'd understand if you tap out during the latter half of Reload. This era is definitely somewhat misunderstood and doesn't deserve all the hate that it gets. Anyways, be sure to follow me on my Bandcamp and follow me on my socials as well. This has been your local Trash Panda Slayer, signing off.